Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive.
It is great to be here.
Before we jump into today's material, I actually want to take a quick second to extend a very warm divine blessing over your day.
Absolutely.
And honestly, over your entire week. May you find clarity and peace and purpose in whatever you're facing right now.
We are so glad you're here with us.
We really are. So today we are heading into some seriously ancient territory.
We are tackling Genesis chapter 22.
Right. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac.
It is a heavy one.
It is. And since you are joining us for this deep dive, you likely already know the basic narrative framework. You know Abraham is told to sacrifice his long-awaited son.
The child of promise.
Exactly. But our mission today is to look past the surface-level Sunday school summary. We are pulling from the detailed historical, linguistic, and theological scholarship of two great sources.
The Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible.
Yes. To really examine the sheer architectural brilliance of this text, we want to unpack the geographical realities and
the translation nuances.
Right. And the deeply embedded prophetic layers that turn this from just a simple ancient chronicle into a masterpiece of theological literature.
Because it is a text that absolutely demands a slow, methodical approach.
Definitely.
When you strip away the familiarity of the story and focus on the precise vocabulary being utilized by the author, as well as the historical backdrop of the ancient Near East, you realize just how much is functioning beneath the text.
It really operates on multiple levels simultaneously.
Right. It is dealing with immediate human trauma, but it is also laying down the foundational blueprint for an entire religious framework.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the opening sentence, because the linguistic tension begins immediately.
Instantly.
The text opens by stating that God tested Abraham.
Right.
Now, for a modern English reader, the word test carries a lot of baggage.
Really does.
It can imply a trap, a setup to fail.
Or a temptation.
Exactly. But looking at the Hebrew linguistics provided in our sources, that opening word is nisa.
Nisa.
And nisa carries a very specific, almost metallurgical connotation.
What's fascinating here is how clearly the biblical text delineates between proving and tempting.
Yeah, because nisa does not mean to tempt or to lure into evil.
No, it specifically means to prove the quality of something, or to test its genuineness.
It is the kind of word you use when you apply heat to a precious metal to reveal its purity.
Not to destroy it.
Exactly, not to destroy it.
The scholarship points us directly to James chapter 1, verse 13 in the New Testament.
Oh, right, that cross-reference.
Which explicitly states that God does not tempt anyone with evil. That cross-reference is vital because it establishes the theological parameters of Genesis 22.
The author wants the reader to know up front that this directive, as horrifying as it sounds—
And it is horrifying.
It is. But it is not an attempt to corrupt Abraham's morality. It is a crucible designed to definitively demonstrate the depth of his allegiance.
And that brings us to the nature of the crucible itself.
Right, because even if we understand the linguistic nuance of nisa, the actual command to offer a child as a burnt offering—
It is viscerally disturbing.
Completely. It seems totally incongruous with the character of the God who called Abraham out of Ur.
It does.
Yeah.
Until you look at the historical context of the Old Testament period in Canaan. That completely reorients how we understand this request.
Right. In the ancient Near Eastern environment where Abraham was living, child sacrifice was not an unheard of anomaly.
Sadly, no.
It was an established, albeit horrific, religious practice among Canaanite pagan cultures. People would literally pass their children through the fire to appease local deities.
That historical data from the Holman Notes is the crucial lens for this entire chapter.
How so?
Well, in the cultural vocabulary of the ancient Near East, the absolute highest proof of devotion a worshiper could offer to a deity was the sacrifice of their firstborn.
Wow.
So God is essentially communicating with Abraham using the extreme religious currency of the era.
That makes so much sense.
The underlying question of the test is whether Abraham is as entirely committed to the invisible true God as his Canaanite neighbors are to their localized physical idols.
So it establishes a comparative baseline of devotion.
Exactly.
That dramatically shifts the psychology of the scene. God is adopting the extreme vernacular of the surrounding culture to definitively separate Abraham's faith from it.
Yes.
And the way Abraham responds to this command is staggering in its efficiency.
The text gives us these very gritty, deliberate details.
He wakes up early in the morning. He personally saddles his donkey.
He splits the wood for the burnt offering himself.
And there is no recorded dialogue with God here, no negotiation, no pleading.
Which is a stark contrast to how Abraham negotiated earlier for the city of Sodom.
That is such a good point. He negotiated for Sodom, but for his own son, nothing. He simply takes 2 servants, his son Isaac, and begins walking.
And the physical journey itself is loaded with significance that is easy to miss if you were just reading for plot.
Right. Our sources map this out geographically. Abraham is traveling from Beersheba to the region of Moriah,
Which is the area of modern-day Jerusalem.
in a straight line that is a distance of roughly 72 kilometers.
Or about 45 miles.
Traversing that specific rugged terrain on foot is exactly a 3-day journey.
But the timeline of 3 days operates as a literary and theological motif. It is not just a travelogue.
No, if you look across the biblical narrative, the 3rd day consistently functions as a marker for divine revelation,
The sources draw a direct line to Exodus 19, verse 11.
where the Israelites are told to consecrate themselves because on the 3rd day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai.
Exactly. The 3rd day represents a period specifically reserved and prepared for a monumental encounter with God.
So for 72 kilometers, Abraham is marching through this heavy symbolic time frame. He is fully aware of the divine appointment waiting at the end of the road.
And the specific location of that divine appointment is equally structural.
Right, the command was to go to the region of Moriah.
Fast forward centuries later, and 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, explicitly identifies Mount Moriah as the exact location where King Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem.
The layers there are incredible. The very soil Abraham is walking on preparing to build an altar for his son
Yes.
is the exact geographic coordinate where the permanent bronze altar of Israel will eventually sit.
The entire Levitical sacrificial system is fundamentally tethered to the geographic coordinates of this specific test.
It is mind-blowing. But before we get to the resolution, we have to look at the dialogue on the road, because it forces us to reevaluate Abraham's mindset,
Isaac is carrying the wood,
which is a striking visual on its own.
and Abraham is carrying the fire and the knife.
And Isaac looks at the setup and asks arguably the most piercing question in the text. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering?
Abraham's response is meticulously worded. He tells Isaac, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.
Now, on a surface reading that sounds like a father who is simply deflecting.
It sounds like he is trying to spare his son the psychological terror of knowing what is about to happen.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the linguistic choices earlier in the narrative suggest Abraham was speaking literal truth. He wasn't offering a comforting deflection.
Let's look at what he told the servants before they started the final ascent.
Yes.
Abraham says to them, "The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we will come back to you."
He deliberately uses the plural pronoun.
He doesn't say, "I will come back," he says, "we."
And the scholarship from the NAA Study Notes points us to the New Testament writer of Hebrews, specifically chapter 11, verses 17 through 19.
For the theological interpretation of that pronoun.
Right. The author of Hebrews posits that Abraham's faith had reached a point where he reasoned that God could raise the dead.
This completely reconstructs our understanding of Abraham's silent march.
He wasn't walking in a state of hopeless resignation.
No, he was operating under a radical, unprecedented theological logic.
God had previously made an unbreakable covenant promise that specifically named Isaac as the heir.
So Abraham weighed the command to sacrifice Isaac against the ironclad promise of Isaac's future.
And he concluded that the only way for both to be true was resurrection.
He firmly believed that if he followed through with the knife, God would literally reconstruct Isaac from the ashes to maintain his own covenant integrity.
It transforms the entire chapter from a tragedy into a masterclass on covenantal trust.
He is essentially daring God to prove his own promises.
Which brings us to the climax on the mountain.
They arrive, they build the altar, and Abraham arranges the wood.
He binds Isaac.
This is where the historical name of the story, the Akedah, comes from. It literally means the binding.
Right.
He places his son on the altar, reaches out his hand, and takes the knife. The narrative tension is stretched to its absolute breaking point.
And at the last possible fraction of a second, the angel of the Lord calls out from heaven, Abraham. Abraham.
The double invocation of the name.
Yes, which is a specific literary device. In ancient biblical literature, repeating a name in that manner is used to communicate absolute desperate urgency.
The intervention is immediate and forceful.
The angel commands him not to lay a hand on the boy, declaring, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me."
The test of genuineness, the Nisa, is complete.
The metallurgical fire has proven the absolute purity of Abraham's devotion.
Here's where it gets really interesting because the narrative immediately shifts from the proving of Abraham to the provision of God.
Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught by its horns in a thicket.
He takes the ram and sacrifices it as a burnt offering in place of his son.
Now, our sources emphasize that this specific action introduces the theological framework of substitutionary atonement.
This isn't just a convenient plot resolution. It is the establishment of a core doctrine.
We really need to unpack that concept of substitutionary atonement clearly because it is the engine that drives much of the later biblical text.
Go for it.
Substitutionary atonement is the mechanism where a life is offered in the place of another life to satisfy a righteous requirement.
Isaac was the one on the altar. The requirement for the sacrifice was made.
But the ram physically takes his place. The animal dies so the human can walk free.
This isolated event on Mount Moriah serves as the literal physical prototype for the abstract theological laws that will later fill the book of Leviticus.
Every sin offering and guilt offering in Israel's future will be predicated on this exact model of a substitute taking the blow.
And the study notes draw a direct, undeniable line from this ram caught in the thicket to the New Testament.
In John 1, verse 29.
Yes, where Jesus is introduced with the title, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
The physical substitution that spared one boy on Mount Moriah is presented as the theological blueprint for the spiritual substitution on the cross that spares humanity.
It paints such a complex portrait of a God who maintains an absolute standard of righteousness, but who simultaneously steps into the narrative to personally supply the very sacrifice required to meet that standard.
This leads to the naming of the site. Because of this intervention, Abraham names the place Jehovah-Jireh,
which translates to, the Lord will provide.
And the text notes a historical proverb that grew out of this specific moment. On the mount of the Lord, it will be provided.
It forever cemented that specific geographic location as the epicenter of divine provision for the people of Israel.
So what does this all mean for the covenant God made with Abraham?
Well, following the sacrifice of the ram, the angel of the Lord calls out a second time. But this isn't another directive. It's a solemn oath.
God declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore.
Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me.
The structural shift in that oath is monumental.
It really is.
If you track the Abrahamic covenant from its inception in Genesis 12, there have always been elements of conditionality attached to it.
Right. Abraham had to leave his homeland. He had to walk blamelessly. He had to enact circumcision.
The promises were tethered to his ongoing cooperation. But the scholarship highlights that this specific oath on Mount Moriah strips away all remaining conditions.
Abraham has decisively passed the ultimate test of allegiance.
Consequently, the covenant is now permanently locked in.
The promise of innumerable descendants, military victory, and global blessing is guaranteed by God's own name.
The NAA Study Notes bring in a brilliant linguistic observation regarding the mechanics of that global blessing.
The oath states that through Abraham's offspring, or seed, all nations will be blessed.
When you trace how later biblical authors interpret that specific phrasing, you find the Apostle Paul in the New Testament analyzing the grammar of Genesis 22.
Right, in Galatians 3, verse 16.
Paul builds a massive theological argument on a single point of grammar from this text.
He points out that the Hebrew word used for seed or offspring in this promise is singular, not plural.
Paul argues that while God is certainly promising a vast physical nation to Israel, the ultimate global blessing is specifically pointing forward to one solitary descendant.
That singular seed is identified as the Messiah.
So this oath operates simultaneously as a national charter for Israel and a deeply prophetic promise about the ultimate redemption of the world through one specific individual.
It is incredibly dense architecture. You have geography aligning with future temples, linguistic nuances, setting up covenantal theology and physical objects prefiguring global atonement.
It's packed.
But after this massive spiritual and prophetic climax, the chapter has to decompress.
Abraham and Isaac descend the mountain, rejoin the servants, and make the 72-kilometer trek back to Beersheba.
And then the chapter concludes with something that often confuses modern readers. A genealogy.
It meticulously lists the descendants of Abraham's brother, Nahor,
detailing names like Uz, Buz, Kemuel, and Cheesed.
After the visceral intensity of the binding ending with a list of distant relatives feels like a bizarre, almost editorial mistake.
It definitely reads like a jarring structural shift, but we have to remember that ancient authors were incredibly economical with their writing.
They did not include filler material. Genealogies in ancient Near Eastern literature consistently serve very deliberate narrative functions.
The study Bibles clarify that this seemingly dry list of names is actually a vital literary bridge.
It is entirely about setting the stage for the next phase of the covenant.
If you look closely at the genealogy, verse 23 specifically isolates a man named Bethuel, noting that he became the father of Rebekah.
The entire function of this genealogical insertion is to quietly introduce Rebekah into the biblical timeline.
Exactly. Chapter 22 secures Isaac's life and permanently locks in the unconditional promise of his innumerable descendants.
But logically, Isaac cannot produce descendants without a wife.
Right.
This genealogy anticipates the narrative arc of chapter 24, where Abraham will dispatch his servant to secure a bride for Isaac.
So the author resolves the immediate crisis of Isaac's survival, and in the very concluding breath of the chapter, drops the name of the specific woman who will be the biological mechanism for fulfilling the massive oath just sworn on the mountain.
It is narrative sequencing at its finest.
Every single verse is carrying weight. The story of the Akedah is the linchpin holding the earlier promises of Genesis together with the future realities of the rest of the Bible.
It really is.
And it brings us back to you listening right now. We have spent this time dissecting the history, the linguistics, and the geography of Genesis 22.
We've seen how this ancient text isn't just a static artifact. It is a meticulously constructed framework that deals with profound human struggle and sweeping divine promises.
But beyond the academics, this text forces us to look at the anatomy of our own faith.
We all encounter our own Moriah moments.
Situations where we are asked to trust a process that seems entirely contradictory, or where we are asked to release our grip on the very things we hold most dear.
The narrative challenges us to consider whether our trust is based on our ability to see the provision or on the character of the provider.
This raises an important thought to leave you with, and it requires looking at the concept of substitution introduced here.
Consider the explicit detail that the ram is the tangible evidence of God's grace allowing Isaac to be spared.
Think about the profound psychological shift for Abraham and Isaac.
Walking down that mountain, not just as survivors, but as the first witnesses to a divine model where God provides the ultimate sacrifice himself.
How does that reality that God supplies what he demands change the way we view the concept of divine demands in our own lives?
It completely reframes how we perceive obedience and provision.
It is a deeply transformative yet incredibly challenging thought to sit with.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of the text. We hope stepping into the linguistic and historical depths gave you a sharper, more vibrant understanding of what is actually happening on that mountain.
It's been a great deep dive.
As we wrap up today, may God bless all of you listeners. Have a phenomenal rest of your week, and we will catch you next time.